The photograph arrived at the Baltimore Sun newsroom on a cold Tuesday morning in March 1903, wrapped in brown paper that smelled faintly of chemicals and decay. Nobody would have noticed it among the usual deliveries of correspondence and advertisements, but when junior reporter Thomas Brennan finally opened the package during his lunch break, he found himself staring at an image that made his coffee go cold in his hand. It was a simple photograph of a hospital ward, rows of iron beds lined against whitewashed walls, nurses in starched uniforms attending to patients. Nothing unusual at first glance. But Thomas had learned during his 3 years at the newspaper to look closer, to notice the details that others missed. And there, in the back corner of the photograph, partially obscured by shadow and the angle of the camera, was a patient who didn't belong. Thomas held the photograph up to the light streaming through the newsroom windows. The image had been taken at Johns Hopkins Hospital. He could tell from the distinctive architecture visible through the ward windows. The date stamped on the back read, February 14th, 1903, just 3 weeks earlier. Most of the patients in the photograph were clearly visible, their faces showing various stages of illness and recovery. But the figure in the back bed was different. The face was turned toward the camera, eyes wide open, staring directly at the lens with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the photographic paper itself. What disturbed Thomas most was the expression, something that resembled neither pain nor fear, but rather a desperate attempt to communicate something urgent. He turned the photograph over. On the back, written in neat but hurried handwriting, was a single sentence that made his pulse quicken. The message was brief and unsigned, reading simply, "Find out who she was before they erase her completely." Thomas read it 3 times, his mind racing through possibilities. Who was the woman in the photograph? Why would anyone want to erase her existence? And most importantly, why had someone sent this to the newspaper? Thomas Brennan was 26 years old and hungry for the story that would make his career. He had spent the last 3 years covering mundane city council meetings and society weddings, watching as senior reporters handled the cases that actually mattered. His editor, Harold Whitman, had made it clear that Thomas needed to prove himself before being trusted with serious investigative work. This mysterious photograph might be exactly the opportunity he had been waiting for, or it might be nothing more than an elaborate hoax designed to waste his time. Either way, he had to find out. He crossed the newsroom to the desk of Margaret Chen, the newspaper's only female reporter, and the person who knew more about Baltimore's medical community than anyone else on staff. Margaret was hunched over her typewriter, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her fingers moving rapidly across the keys. She didn't look up when Thomas approached, but she spoke before he could say anything. Her voice was matter-of-fact, tinged with the slight accent that revealed her Chinese immigrant parents. She had fought harder than anyone to earn her position at the newspaper, and she protected her time fiercely. Thomas placed the photograph on her desk without a word. Margaret's fingers stopped mid-keystroke. She picked up the photograph, studied it for a long moment, then looked up at Thomas with an expression he had never seen on her face before. It was recognition, mixed with something that looked uncomfortably like fear. She set the photograph down carefully, as if it might burn her fingers, and pushed her chair back from the desk. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke, and what she said would change everything Thomas thought he knew about the city he called home. Margaret's words hung in the air between them, like smoke. She had seen this woman before, not in person, but in whispered conversations among the hospital staff she interviewed for her medical column. The nurses at Johns Hopkins had a name for her, though they only spoke it behind closed doors and never in the presence of doctors or administrators. They called her the lost patient, a woman who had been admitted to the hospital 6 months earlier, and whose very existence seemed to be systematically disappearing from all official records. Margaret had dismissed the rumors as hospital gossip, the kind of stories that spread in any institution where death was a daily occurrence. But now, staring at the photographic evidence, she realized the nurses had been telling the truth. Thomas pulled up a chair, his notebook already open, pen poised. Margaret explained what she knew, which wasn't much, but was enough to confirm that something deeply wrong was happening at one of Baltimore's most respected institutions. The woman had been brought to Johns Hopkins in September 1902, suffering from what the admitting physician described as severe malnutrition and possible exposure to industrial toxins. She had no identification. No family came forward to claim her, and she spoke very little during her first weeks in the hospital. The nurses who cared for her reported that she seemed terrified of the doctors, particularly one specific physician whose name Margaret had never been able to confirm. What made the case unusual was what happened next. According to Margaret's sources, the woman's condition had actually improved during her first month at the hospital. She had begun eating regularly, gaining weight, and even started to communicate more with the nursing staff. She told one nurse that she had worked at a textile factory near the harbour, that she had seen something she shouldn't have seen, and that powerful people wanted to make sure she never spoke about it. The nurse had documented these conversations in her personal notes, knowing that such information would never appear in the official hospital records. But then, in late October, everything changed. The woman's condition deteriorated rapidly, not from her original ailment, but from what appeared to be complications from a new treatment protocol prescribed by that same unnamed physician. The nurses noticed needle marks on her arms that hadn't been there before, and the woman's lucid moments became increasingly rare. When the nurses questioned the treatment, they were told to mind their own business and focus on their assigned duties. One nurse who persisted in asking questions was quietly transferred to a different ward. The message was clear: this patient was not to be discussed. By December, the woman had become a ghost within the hospital, rarely conscious, barely responding to stimuli. The few nurses brave enough to check on her reported that her bed was often empty during the day, and they had no idea where she was taken or what procedures were being performed. The official patient logs showed increasingly sparse entries, and some nurses suspected that pages had been removed entirely. Then, in January, something even stranger occurred. The woman disappeared from her bed for 3 full days, and when she returned, she was different. Her eyes had that desperate, haunted quality visible in the photograph, as if she understood that time was running out. Margaret finished her account and looked at Thomas with an expression that was both challenge and warning. She told him that pursuing this story would be dangerous, that Johns Hopkins Hospital was protected by some of the wealthiest and most influential families in Baltimore, and that a junior reporter making accusations against such an institution would find his career over before it truly began. But she also told him that if the rumors were true, if someone was indeed using hospital patients for unauthorized experiments or worse, then the story needed to be told regardless of the personal cost. Thomas looked down at the photograph, at the woman's desperate eyes staring back at him across time and circumstance, and made his decision. The following morning, Thomas stood outside the main entrance of Johns Hopkins Hospital, watching nurses and doctors come and go through the heavy wooden doors. The building was an imposing structure of red brick and white trim, its architecture speaking of medical progress and institutional confidence. Inside those walls, some of the finest physicians in America performed surgeries and developed treatments that would shape the future of medicine. But inside those same walls, if Margaret's sources were correct, something dark was also taking place, hidden beneath layers of professional respectability and administrative bureaucracy. Thomas had spent the previous evening researching everything he could find about unauthorized medical experiments. The practice was not uncommon in 1903, though it was rarely discussed in polite society. Poor patients, immigrants, and those without family connections were sometimes used as test subjects for new procedures without their knowledge or consent. The medical establishment justified these practices with the argument that advancing scientific knowledge served the greater good, even if individual patients suffered in the process. But there was a difference between experimental treatment and whatever had happened to the woman in the photograph, and Thomas was determined to discover exactly where that line had been crossed. He had dressed carefully for this visit, wearing his best suit and carrying a leather portfolio that made him look more established than he actually was. His plan was simple: pose as a medical student from the University of Maryland, researching patient outcomes, gain access to the hospital records and find any documentation related to the woman in the photograph. It was a risky approach that could easily backfire, but Thomas couldn't think of a better way to get inside the hospital's administrative offices. He took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and walked through the entrance with the confident stride of someone who belonged there. The hospital's interior was cleaner and more modern than Thomas had expected. The floors were polished wood, the walls painted a soothing pale green, and the smell of carbolic acid hung in the air, that distinctive antiseptic scent that characterized all modern medical facilities. Nurses moved purposefully through the corridors, their shoes clicking against the floor, their faces showing the professional composure that came from dealing with suffering every day. Thomas stopped one of them, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and silver hair just visible beneath her white cap, and asked for directions to the records office. The nurse studied him for a moment, her expression suggesting she saw through his confident facade. But something in Thomas's face must have convinced her of his sincerity, because she pointed down a long hallway and told him to take the stairs to the basement level, then follow the corridor to the last door on the right. She added, in a voice low enough that only Thomas could hear, that he should be careful what he went looking for, because some answers came with consequences. Thomas thanked her and headed in the direction she had indicated, his heart beating faster with each step. The basement corridor was dimmer than the upper floors, lit by gas lamps that cast flickering shadows on the walls. Thomas's footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, and he became acutely aware that he was now in a part of the hospital where visitors rarely ventured. The doors he passed were labeled with cryptic abbreviations: storage, maintenance, medical waste disposal. At the end of the corridor he found the door marked Records and Administration. He paused outside, listening for voices within, then turned the handle and stepped inside, hoping his luck would hold just a little longer. The records office was larger than Thomas had anticipated, a cavernous room filled with wooden filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of paper and dust, and the only light came from a single lamp on a desk near the entrance. Behind that desk sat a clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers, who looked up with obvious annoyance at the interruption. Thomas launched into his rehearsed explanation about medical research and patient outcomes, speaking with academic authority he didn't quite possess. The clerk listened with barely concealed skepticism, his eyes narrowing behind his spectacles. For a moment, Thomas thought his plan would fail before it even began. But then the clerk sighed, stood up from his desk, and told Thomas he could spend 30 minutes reviewing non-confidential records, under supervision, and only in the designated research area. It wasn't ideal, but it was access. The clerk led Thomas to a small table in the corner of the room, then disappeared into the maze of filing cabinets. He returned several minutes later, carrying an armload of ledgers, dropped them on the table with a heavy thud, and reminded Thomas that he was being watched before returning to his desk. Thomas opened the first ledger with hands that trembled slightly. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, columns of names and dates and medical conditions, the mundane administrative record of human suffering. He scanned through September 1902, looking for any admission that matched what Margaret had told him: female patient, unknown identity, industrial toxin exposure. There were dozens of admissions that month, but none that perfectly matched the description. He moved to the second ledger, then the third, his eyes straining in the dim light, his 30 minutes ticking away with alarming speed. Then he found it. October 12, 1902. Patient number 2847, admitted from the Harbour District, female, approximately 30 years of age, presenting with malnutrition and chemical burns. No name recorded, no next of kin. The entry was brief, almost deliberately vague, but it had to be the same woman. Thomas quickly scanned the subsequent entries, watching the woman's treatment unfold in terse medical notation. The entries became increasingly sparse after October 31st, just as Margaret had said. November showed only 3 brief notes. December had 2. January had 1 entry, dated January 8th, which read simply, "Patient condition deteriorated. Transferred to specialized care facility for advanced treatment." There was no entry for February, which meant either the woman was no longer in the hospital system or her records had been deliberately removed from these ledgers. Thomas flipped through the remaining pages, but found nothing more. He was about to close the ledger when something caught his eye. At the bottom of the January 8th entry, in handwriting different from the rest of the page, Someone had added a single line in pencil, then partially erased it. Thomas held the page up to the light, squinting to make out the faded words. What he read made his blood run cold. The partially erased note said, "Treatment Protocol Authorization. Dr. Clayton Ashford, Private Research Wing. No family notification required." Thomas recognized the name immediately. Clayton Ashford was one of the most prominent physicians in Baltimore, a man whose research on infectious diseases had earned him recognition throughout the medical community. He came from old money, the Ashford family having made their fortune in shipping and manufacturing. He was also, Thomas suddenly remembered, on the board of directors for several textile factories in the Harbor District, the same area where the woman had worked. Thomas quickly copied the information into his notebook, his mind racing through the implications. If Dr. Ashford was personally involved in this woman's treatment, if he had authorized a private research wing that didn't appear in any official hospital documentation, then this case was far bigger than Thomas had initially realized. This wasn't just about one mysterious patient. This was about a prominent physician, a respected institution, and a system that allowed certain people to operate outside normal oversight. Thomas closed the ledger and stood up, trying to keep his expression neutral despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The clerk glanced up from his desk, and Thomas nodded his thanks before walking toward the door, the weight of what he had discovered pressing heavily on his shoulders. Outside the hospital, Thomas took a deep breath of cold Baltimore air and checked his pocket watch. It was just past 11 in the morning. He had names now, dates, and a trail that led directly to one of the city's most powerful medical figures. What he didn't have was proof that any crime had actually been committed, or any idea what had ultimately happened to the woman in the photograph. But he knew where to look next, and more importantly, he knew he couldn't stop now. Thomas returned to the newsroom with his mind spinning through possibilities. He needed to find someone who had worked at the textile factories near the harbor, someone who might remember a woman who disappeared 6 months ago. Margaret was still at her desk, and when Thomas approached with the information he had discovered, she listened intently, then reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a worn address book. She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for, then wrote an address on a scrap of paper and handed it to Thomas. It was the home of Sarah Mitchell, a former factory worker who now ran a boarding house for immigrant women near the Harbor District. Thomas caught the streetcar heading south, watching the city change as he traveled. The elegant brownstones and tree-lined streets near the newspaper office gave way to narrower roads and buildings darkened by factory smoke. By the time he reached the Harbor District, the air itself tasted different, heavy with salt and coal dust, and something chemical that burned the back of his throat. The address Margaret had given him led to a 3-story wooden building that leaned slightly to one side, its paint peeling and windows patched with cardboard. Sarah Mitchell answered the door herself, a woman in her 50s with hands roughened by decades of factory work and eyes that had seen too much suffering to be easily shocked. Thomas introduced himself and explained he was investigating a missing woman. Sarah studied him for a long moment, then invited him inside to a small parlor where several women sat mending clothes by lamplight. She told them to continue working and led Thomas to a corner where they could speak privately. When Thomas described the woman from the photograph, Sarah's expression changed. She knew exactly who Thomas was talking about. The woman's name was Catherine Morrison, and she had worked at the Ashford textile mill until last September. Catherine had been one of the best workers, quick and careful, supporting herself and sending money to her younger sister in Pennsylvania. But then something happened that changed everything. Catherine had been working late one evening, cleaning the machinery after the other workers had left, when she witnessed an accident that shouldn't have been an accident at all. Sarah explained that Catherine had seen one of the supervisors deliberately sabotage a piece of equipment that would be used by workers the following day. When Catherine confronted him, the supervisor told her to keep her mouth shut if she knew what was good for her. But Catherine wasn't the type to stay silent when she knew other women's lives were at risk. She reported what she had seen to the factory manager, and that's when the real trouble started. The manager was Dr. Clayton Ashford's cousin and the Ashford family had too much invested in the textile business to allow a scandal about unsafe working conditions to become public. Catherine was fired the next day, officially for poor work performance, but everyone knew the real reason. She tried to find work at other factories, but word had spread that she was a troublemaker. Within weeks, Catherine was living on the streets, unable to afford food or shelter. That's when she collapsed near the harbour and was taken to Johns Hopkins Hospital, where Dr. Ashford himself happened to be on duty. Thomas felt his chest tighten as Sarah continued the story. Catherine had told some of the other factory women what had happened, afraid that if something happened to her, no one would know the truth. She had tried to get help from the police, but they dismissed her complaints, suggesting she was simply a disgruntled former employee making false accusations against a respected family. Catherine had no money for a lawyer, no family connections to protect her, and no institutional power to fight against men like the Ashfords. She had been exactly the kind of person the system could easily ignore. Sarah stood and walked to a small wooden chest in the corner of the room. She opened it and removed a bundle of letters tied with string. These were letters Catherine had written to her sister in Pennsylvania during her last months working at the factory. The sister had sent them to Sarah after Catherine disappeared, hoping someone in Baltimore might know what had happened. Sarah had kept them safe, waiting for someone who might actually care enough to investigate. She handed the bundle to Thomas, telling him to read them carefully, because they contained information that powerful people had tried very hard to keep hidden. Thomas spent the next hour reading Catherine's letters while Sarah brought him coffee, and the other women in the boarding house went about their evening routines. The letters painted a picture of a woman who had been vibrant and hopeful, who had believed that hard work and honesty would eventually lead to a better life. But they also revealed something else, something that made Thomas's investigation take on a darker dimension. Catherine had been keeping detailed notes about safety violations at the Ashford textile mill, documenting every incident, every injury, every time management chose profit over worker protection. In her final letter, dated just days before she collapsed, Catherine wrote that she had hidden these notes in a safe place and that if anything happened to her, her sister should contact the Baltimore Sun newspaper. She had specifically mentioned Thomas's editor, Harold Whitman, having read one of his editorials about labor reform. But the letter had been lost in the mail system for weeks, and by the time Catherine's sister received it and tried to send word to Baltimore, Catherine had already vanished into the hospital system. Thomas carefully returned the letters to Sarah and asked if she had any idea where Catherine might have hidden her factory notes. Sarah shook her head, but then one of the other women spoke up from across the room. She said Catherine had rented a small room above a bakery on Eastern Avenue before she lost her job, and that the landlord was a sympathetic man who let tenants leave belongings even after they could no longer pay rent. If Catherine had hidden something important, that room would be the most likely place. Thomas wrote down the address, thanked Sarah for her help, and headed back into the cold Baltimore night, aware that he was now carrying information that made him a threat to very powerful people. The bakery on Eastern Avenue was closed when Thomas arrived, but a light burned in the window of the apartment above. He knocked on the side door until an elderly man appeared, Flower still dusting his apron despite the late hour. Thomas explained he was looking for belongings left by a former tenant named Catherine Morrison, and the baker's expression immediately became guarded. He asked Thomas why he wanted to know and what business it was of his. Thomas made a quick decision and told the truth, explaining he was a reporter investigating Catherine's disappearance and that he believed she might be in danger. The baker studied Thomas's face, then opened the door wider and invited him inside. He led Thomas up a narrow staircase to the third floor, where a small room sat at the end of the hallway. The baker unlocked the door and explained that Catherine had been a good tenant, who always paid on time, and when she stopped coming around he had worried something bad had happened. He had kept her few belongings safe, hoping she would return someday. The room was sparse, containing only a narrow bed, a small table, and a wooden trunk pushed against the wall. Thomas opened the trunk carefully. Inside were a few items of clothing, a Bible, and a tin box locked with a small padlock. The baker produced a key ring and tried several keys until one fit. Inside the tin box were dozens of pages covered in Catherine's neat handwriting, documenting 3 years of safety violations at the Ashford textile mill. The detail was extraordinary. Dates, times, names of injured workers, descriptions of faulty equipment that management refused to repair, records of complaints that were ignored or dismissed. This was evidence that could destroy the Ashford family's reputation and potentially lead to criminal charges. But there was something else in the box, something that explained why Catherine's case had become so dangerous. Tucked between the pages was a letter written by Dr. Clayton Ashford himself to his cousin, the factory manager. The letter, dated August 1902, discussed the need to address the Morrison problem and suggested that if Catherine could be discredited or removed from Baltimore entirely, the family's business interests would be protected. The letter stopped short of explicitly ordering violence, but the implication was clear enough to be damning. Thomas carefully packed everything back into the tin box and thanked the baker, promising to do everything possible to help Catherine. As he left the building and started walking back toward the streetcar stop, Thomas became aware that he was being followed. 2 men in dark coats had appeared from the shadows and were maintaining a steady distance behind him. Thomas quickened his pace, his heart pounding, clutching the tin box tightly against his chest. He turned down an alley, hoping to lose them in the maze of side streets, but the men followed, their footsteps echoing behind him in the darkness. Thomas ran through the narrow alley, his breath coming in sharp gasps, the tin box clutched against his ribs. He emerged onto a broader street, where a few late-night pedestrians were still walking, and the 2 men pursuing him seemed to melt back into the shadows. Thomas didn't slow down until he reached the better-lit streets near the newspaper office. He went straight to Harold Whitman's home, pounding on the door until his editor appeared in a dressing gown, annoyed at the interruption, but quickly becoming alert when he saw Thomas's condition. Thomas laid out everything he had discovered: the photograph, Catherine Morrison's identity, the factory notes, Dr. Ashford's letter. Whitman examined the documents carefully, his expression growing increasingly grave. He explained that publishing this story would put the newspaper at significant legal and financial risk, that the Ashford family would deploy every resource to destroy both Thomas's credibility and the Sun's reputation. But he also said that this was exactly the kind of story the newspaper existed to tell, and that if they didn't stand up for people like Catherine Morrison, then their editorial principles meant nothing. The story ran on the front page 3 days later. Thomas had worked with Margaret to verify every detail, to build a case so thoroughly documented that even the Ashford family's lawyers couldn't dismiss it as fabrication. The headline read, "Hopkins Hospital Patient Used in Unauthorized Research After Factory Retaliation." The article detailed Catherine's experience at the textile mill, her subsequent mistreatment, and Dr. Ashford's involvement in what appeared to be retaliatory medical experimentation disguised as treatment. The response was immediate and explosive. The Ashford family demanded retractions and threatened lawsuits, but other newspapers picked up the story, and soon reporters across Baltimore were investigating similar cases of poor patients receiving questionable treatment. The Maryland Medical Board launched an inquiry into Dr. Ashford's research protocols. The factory workers at Ashford Textile Mill, emboldened by the attention, organized to demand safer working conditions. Most importantly, Catherine Morrison was found. She had been transferred to a private facility in the countryside, kept sedated and isolated, but still alive. Once the story became public, the facility released her to the care of nurses who had originally treated her at Johns Hopkins, women who had risked their careers to provide information to Margaret and Thomas. Catherine's recovery was slow, and the damage done to her would never fully heal, but she survived. She testified before the medical board, her voice shaking but clear, describing everything that had been done to her. Dr. Clayton Ashford was stripped of his hospital privileges and left Baltimore in disgrace. The Ashford textile mill was forced to implement new safety measures and pay compensation to injured workers. Thomas Brennan's career was made, his byline now appearing regularly on significant investigative stories. But late at night, when he looked at the photograph that had started everything, he thought about all the other patients who hadn't been as fortunate as Catherine Morrison, all the people whose stories would never be told because no one had cared enough to look closely at the patient in the back of the photograph. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.